If you play games, chances are that you played Pokemon, even if your parents thought it was some strange thing that would bring demons into your house. I'm serious. People thought like that in the 90s. Pocket Monsters, or more commonly known as Pokemon, is a franchise that originated in Japan in the late 80s to early 90s, and it took the world by storm. It led to the creation of marketable plushies, promotional game cabinets, cars, hell, they even painted some planes with a Pokemon library. So I think it's sufficient to say that Pokemon is a big deal. But there was a time where it was a little bit different. Pokemon was initially based on the childhood shenanigans of a man by the name of Satoshi Tajiri, born in 1965. He spent his time in a suburb of Tokyo known as Machida, collecting insects and other small creatures in the forest that surrounded his town. This, unfortunately, ended when Japan experienced an economic miracle in the late 1960s, when his home city was expanded, replacing the lush forest of his childhood with a more concrete one. By the age of 13, Tajiri discovered that an arcade hall would be opening in his neighborhood, thus spawning his love for gaming as a whole. Not only did this arcade hall spark Tajiri's love for the world of games, but it also led him to self-publish a gaming magazine by the name of Game Freak. Game Freak's first issue was published in March of 1983, with Tajiri being 17 at the time. It was one of the first gaming magazines to be published in Japan, and its popularity grew as it really filled a niche in the market that didn't exist at the time. Tajiri was soon after contacted by Ken Sugimori, an aspiring manga artist who thereafter became Game Freak's illustrator. By January of 1987, Game Freak as a magazine was failing to publish regularly and was ended soon after, but not without reward, as Tajiri became a well-respected game journalist due to his efforts on the magazine. This experience led Tajiri to come into contact with Tsunekazu Ishihara, who was considered to be one of the most well-connected people in the industry at the time. He would go on to co-create and co-own the Pokemon franchise, as well as co-create my biggest money hole, the Pokemon trading card game. After this fated encounter, Tajiri and Sugimori, along with others, created an informal developer team, named after their magazine that kickstarted it all, Game Freak. They began to produce a game called Quinty, or Mendel Palace in the West, a puzzle game that would go on to inspire the creation of the Pokemon series, but there was a big problem. No one in the group knew how to compose a game's soundtrack, thus Junichi Masuda was contacted and became Game Freak's composer. After the release and success of Quinty, Game Freak Co. was incorporated on April 26, 1989, officially kicking off the company that would bring Pokemon to life. If you haven't already, this is my once a video shill to ask you to maybe sub, and maybe perhaps click that bell so you get a little notification of when I post. Thank you. After the release of Quinty, and even before the incorporation of Game Freak as a company, Tajiri began to shift his focus more to the idea of Pokemon and how to capture the essence and story of a boy's summer day. He caught wind of Nintendo's announcement of the Game Boy, a handheld console featuring a port and a cable that would link two Game Boys together. This made Tajiri think back to a time where he and Sugimori were playing Dragon Quest II on the NES, where there's an item called the Mysterious Hat, and it's super rare. Tajiri encountered none, while Sugimori encountered two. This made Tajiri realize that the existence of the link cable meant that players could transfer data between cartridges, and it led him to combine his childhood memories of collecting bugs and lizards and other creatures with this new inspiration to create the base idea that would evolve into Pokemon. The first thing Tajiri did with his team was get together and talk about a game that revolved around the collection of creatures of varying rarity, and since the Game Boy was portable, the idea of these creatures being traded with other players in real life was also discussed. The idea was then expanded into what happened after these creatures were caught. The team brought in inspiration from a series called Ultra 7, a show that Tajiri enjoyed as a kid, where the series protagonist owned capsules that contained miniature versions of kaiju, which emerged full-size from these capsules after being thrown up into the air. These capsules might seem similar to Gachapon capsules as well, which those and kaiju as a whole had a pretty big influence on the main idea of Pokemon. After these base ideas were set in stone, Tajiri and the Game Freak team had to come up with a name for these creatures. Having monsters in capsules led them originally to name the franchise Capumon, or Capsule Monsters, but this unfortunately was unable to be trademarked, so the name Pokemon, or Pocket Monsters, was what was settled on after much decision. A company named Ape Inc., an affiliate of Nintendo, was created in March of 1989 with the intent to both develop a new RPG game by the name of Mother, but also give outside talent the chance to pitch new games. Tajiri was once again fated to work with Ishihara as he was involved in Ape's management. This relationship gave Tajiri the chance to pitch Pokemon to Ape, and his idea was brought to Nintendo's president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi. The interesting thing was that Ishihara came up with an idea similar to Tajiri's, Toto, which essentially wanted to use the Game Boy as a sort of insect cage to capture creatures within it. Game Freak and Ape decided to merge these projects together and initially began work on the project together, but according to Tajiri, the collaboration was difficult as Ape was also working on Earthbound at the time. The final decision to split off from Ape in order to develop Pokemon was ultimately made. Development finally began at the beginning of 1990. Tajiri led the direction of the project, whereas Ishihara was the game's producer, managing the budget and staff, monitoring the game's overall progress, and keeping Nintendo updated on things. He's also helped with debugging and contributed some development ideas. The team was set, Sugimori being in charge of character and graphics design, Masuda being in charge of the sound design and overall soundtrack, and Tajiri leading the charge. The budget that Nintendo gave Game Freak for this project was small, so the ideas of Pokemon were extremely limited by this. Not to mention that Pokemon was currently sort of a side project for Game Freak, being worked on in the time that they weren't working on other projects, like Smart Ball, Mario & Wario, Pulseman, and Yoshi, among others. Yoshi was a game that Nintendo commissioned Game Freak to complete, and the game ended up selling a hefty 3 million copies worldwide. This success led to the overall survival of Game Freak. During the development of these other games, the on and off development of Pokemon continued. By 1992, most of the original 151 Pokemon were designed, and polls were held in office to decide on what other species of Pokemon to include. Even during this time, most of the development of Pokemon was stopped until 1994 after Pulseman was released. Tajiri decided that it was finally time for the development of Pokemon to take off, and a number of new staff were brought on board, like Etsuko Nishida, who was credited with designing and creating Pikachu. Ishihara was also still very much involved with the development of Pokemon at this time, proposing a more in-depth battling system, as well as being the one to bring up the idea of Pokemon types, and being the one to propose the idea of the Pokedex. Originally, Tajiri wanted Pokemon to be a more personalized experience, wanting the game to generate a number from 1 to 65,535 and have this ID and player name assigned to a Pokemon when caught. This generated ID would generate different in-game landscapes and give players different Pokemon, but in the end, this idea was just too ambitious for the team to complete. This idea was brought to Shigeru Miyamoto, who initially thought the idea would be too hard for players to understand, and instead proposed using color cartridges to signify which version of the game a player would have instead. According to Tajiri, 5 to 7 colors were originally considered, but the team eventually settled on 2, red and green. Aside from some Pokemon who would be version exclusive, both versions of the game were practically the same. By the end of development, Pokemon had 3 different owners. Game Freak being the main developer, Nintendo being the publisher, and Creatures Inc., a company founded by Ishihara to represent, well, himself. Pokemon Red and Green was finally finished in December of 1995, missing its original release window of December 21st, 1995, and instead being released in Japan on February 27th, 1996. On release, Pokemon was originally ignored by the media as a whole, and Nintendo had little to no expectations of Red and Green due to how the Game Boy was practically at the end of its life cycle. Units continued to be created and released to the public, and in 1995, a new and improved version of the Game Boy was released, titled the Game Boy Pocket. This version of the Game Boy had no affiliation with the release of Pocket Monsters, but this coincidence would end up largely helping both parties out. A version of Pokemon was brought to the new hires of Game Freak in order to comb through the code for bugs, as well as redo some of the old sprites, and honestly, some of the original sprites really needed a new coat of paint. This new version was dubbed Pokemon Blue, and was originally meant to stay within Game Freak's walls as a training tool. The main fear of releasing Blue was that consumers would be confused and think that this was an entirely new game. Instead, a proposition was made to release Blue through mail order for a limited time, informing consumers that this was an updated version and not a standalone one. This was greenlit and announced in the November 1996 issue of CoroCoro magazine, and the offer ended up exceeding Nintendo's original 300,000 unit expectation, and 600,000 copies were ordered. In total, Pokemon Red, Green, and Blue would end up selling a staggering 10 million copies in Japan alone. On the North American side of things, Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa saw a lot of promise in the release of Pokemon to a Western audience, but Nintendo of Japan had no plans to release Red and Green, as they saw that JRPGs didn't really seem to do as well on this side of the world. Miyamoto was also reported to have said,
"When we started this project in Japan, one of the first things I was told was that this kind of thing would never appeal to American audiences. They said, because the characters are in a very Japanese style, you cannot sell them to Americans. So from the very beginning, I never thought there would be an English version. Now it's just as popular in the United States, and I realized we shouldn't always believe the opinions of conservative marketers."
The funniest thing to me is the fact that Nintendo of America considered a complete redesign of the franchise for Western audiences, as they thought that Pokemon was too cute of a franchise for Americans. They contracted external artists to redesign some of the Pokemon, with the most notable being a redesign of Pikachu. Instead of being the electric rat we know and love today, it turned into some type of tiger with huge boobs, according to Ishihara. The redesign idea was scrapped in favor of localizing and releasing Red and Blue to the rest of the world, as well as 4Kids localizing the Pokemon anime for American audiences. The Pokemon trading card game created by Ishihara in Japan was also localized for America. And oh boy, was Nintendo of Japan wrong when they said that Americans would not like Pokemon. After the release of Red and Blue, a craze swept through America. People could not get enough of this funny little game with the cute little monsters. Red and Blue sold 200,000 copies within its first month, and the Pokemon anime became the highest-rated syndicated children's show on weekdays. The Pokemon movie was also released in America to critical acclaim, so I think it's safe to assume that Pokemon would be here to stay. This led to the creation of the Pokemon Company and Pokemon USA to help run Pokemon on this side of the world, but this creeps into the release of Pokemon Gold and Silver, a discussion I think we can get into in another time. Pokemon was one of those right place, right time situations. A collaboration of the most perfect circumstances for something like this to come to life. I myself was post-Pokemania, but man, it would have been so cool to have grown up and experienced how much of a cultural phenomenon Pokemon was, and honestly, I would consider that it still is, as the games, TCG, and anime continue to bring in and bring back fans both young and old. Pokemon as a franchise shows no signs of slowing down to me, and they were really onto something with that slogan. You really can't help but to want to catch them all. Hi, it's me again. Thank you guys so much for sticking by to the end of my autistic fixation video. It really means the world. What'd you guys think? Do you guys have any memories or the like from this era of Pokemon? Let me know down in the comments below so I can live vicariously through your comment. It's fine, don't worry about it. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts, qualms, comments telling me I suck, you know, the usual. Anyway, go, get on with your day, go do something productive. Remember, don't drink and drive, don't do anything too silly or too goofy, and I'll see everybody in the next one.